Hello, everyone. So something pretty terrible happened at UC Berkeley a couple of days ago, and I want to look into it a little bit further because I think it raises some interesting questions about media bias, identity politics, and also politically motivated violence that, in my opinion, seems to be escalating in the US lately. Meet Pablo Gomez. Gomez is a UC Berkeley student accused of stabbing two women, leaving one dead last Friday. There's a bit of a plot twist, though, because when Berkeley side broke the story a couple days ago, one of Pablo's friends contacted them to let them know that they were misgendering Pablo. You see, Pablo doesn't identify as a he, they identify as a they. But why should that matter? Why should the gender or racial identity of a murderer or their victims be relevant when discussing stories like this? Well, because this story comes to us just a couple of days after the story of the mentally handicapped white kid who got kidnapped and beaten and tortured and had his life threatened by four black teenagers who were screaming, "Fuck white people" and "Fuck Trump" the entire time. And after that story broke, it became very, very clear that racial identity in particular really makes a big impact on how the media will cover and discuss stories like this. Personally, what originally got me interested in this whole identity politics debate that's been raging in the West for the last 5 years was the UCSB Elliot Rodgers shooting. Because for the better part of 25 years now, the US has been going through this revolving cycle of trying to pin the blame for our mass shootings and gun violence on different things. And I remember with Columbine, they initially tried to blame the shootings on Marilyn Manson. And when it turned out that Dylan Harris and Eric Klebold didn't even like Marilyn Manson, and we discovered that they were huge Doom fanatics, then the blame shifted to video games. So we had this ongoing debate about whether violent lyrics and violent music and violent video games were creating a culture of violence. And then you fast forward another 10 or 15 years, and you've got the Aurora movie theater shooting, and then the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and we started talking about guns and specific types of guns, whether assault weapons and the culture surrounding assault weapons was either encouraging violence or enabling it. And throughout all of this, you've had a chorus of people, music doesn't make people kill people, video games don't lead to violence, and of course, guns don't kill people kill people. But when we get to Elliot Rodgers, we settled on something new. No, guns don't kill people. Men kill people. I've been a left-leaning liberal for about as long as I've known what politics was about. My parents sent me to a private Christian high school, and I sought out the quirky, non-conforming oddball kids to be friends with because, in my mind, that's what Jesus would do. But what I discovered over the years that passed was that my non-Christian and otherwise non-conforming friends were discriminated against pretty heavily, not only by their peers, our classmates who are supposed to be showing the love and tolerance of Christ, but also by their teachers who have significant academic power over them and the power to affect their grades and their future. And one by one, a lot of my friends started to open up to me about the fact that they had been closeted about their sexuality or had experienced sexual or physical abuse in their past, either from partners or strangers or from parents. And so promoting equality and standing up to discrimination became really important principles for me. So did gay rights and sexual abuse. So I was pretty fucking pissed when the Elliot Rodgers story broke that the feminist movement, which defines itself by these values, by promoting equality and ending discrimination and standing up to abuse, turned aggressively, or at least became very apparent in their antagonism towards men as a whole, attacking men and disguising it through this rhetoric of just attacking cultural masculinity. See, by being a part of the religious community, I've witnessed firsthand what happens when an otherwise well-meaning ideological group succumbs to dogmatism. An outgroup gets chosen, and discrimination always follows. I've seen what hate the sin, love the sinner looks like in practice, and what it usually means is, I have no hate towards you as an individual gay man, but as a collective group, the rights of gay people do not matter to me, and I will oppose them because it's against my beliefs. So when I hear, feminists don't hate men, we hate toxic masculinity, I knew exactly what was coming next, and I have not been surprised any step of the way as the media has swallowed this narrative and pushed this narrative of male violence against minorities, against gay people, against women nonstop, while excusing, redefining, covering up, and ignoring violence that is aimed against men or against white people. And that is what brings me back to the events of the past few weeks, because I'm very curious to see how the left-wing media, and feminist journalists in particular, are going to cover this story if they cover it at all. Because they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place on this one. On the one hand, a woman was murdered, which almost necessitates the women are victims of a heteropatriarchal society in which male dominance threatens women's livelihood and safety. On the other hand, the murderer was a non-binary trans person, which the left-wing media and social justice warriors have been very adamant about protecting and shielding from criticism, and they've been trying to highlight the hate and discrimination that these groups face. So if they cover this story, it's going to risk a lot of backlash against the trans community and possibly put trans people at risk. We've seen left-wing feminist hand-wringing over events like this in the past, most notably perhaps back in 2015 on New Year's Eve, when 1,000 German women reported sexual assault, battery, and rape at the hands of a swarm of Third World Arab immigrants. In the wake of those events, numerous prominent feminist journalists like Clementine Ford, Lori Penny, Jessica Valenti, as well as a host of progressive media outlets refused to comment on or cover the story whatsoever, with several of them ultimately coming out accusing anyone discussing the events as having some sort of racist anti-immigrant narrative, effectively placing the security of immigrants over their commitment to standing up to sexual assault and kind of throwing the victims under the bus. But we have a much more recent example of how the left-wing media fixates on identity when discussing violent crime in the U.S. Let's take a look at how CNN covered the recent kidnapping.
When you look at this, Simone, they're saying F white people, F Trump. How can you say it's not a hate crime against a white person?
We cannot callously go about classifying things as a hate crime. Motive here matters. So, was this for hate of Donald Trump, the president-elect, because of things that he has said, or was this for pure hate of white people? That matters, because if we start going around and anytime someone says something or does something really egregious, really bad, and sickening in this instance in connection with the president-elect or Donald Trump, or even President Obama for that matter, because of their political leanings, that is slippery territory. That is not a hate crime. Hate crimes are because of a person's racial ethnicity, their religion, their gender, a disability. It is your political leanings, because someone doesn't like your political leanings and they do something bad to you. That is not a hate crime.
But Alice, even...
Well, technically she's right. Violence against a person over political differences is not technically a hate crime. Actually, there's a different word for politically based violence. So, of course, it seems a little bit of a stretch to refer to that kidnapping as an act of terrorism. We tend to associate terrorism with executions or mass shootings or bombings, large-scale public displays of brutality that usually result in people being killed. I first saw someone refer to the kidnappers as terrorists on Twitter, and my first reaction was, oh, come on, isn't that a little bit ridiculous, a little bit of a stretch? But we are talking about some teenagers who intentionally filmed and broadcast themselves attacking and harming a person for either A, being white, or B, voting for Trump. So from where I'm sitting, there's really only two options. Either this was a racially based hate crime, or it was intended to send a message to Trump-supporting white people that if you voted for or support Donald Trump, this is what's going to happen to you. And I find it very interesting that Simone here seems to prefer the latter option to the former. I find that very telling, that she would go on live TV and insinuate that no, this was about politics, not about race, because I think that has some very interesting implications.
This is one particularly grotesque example of a kind of casual violence, a kind of casual violence that we just take for granted in the United States.
Yeah, Simone, I'm sorry. Go ahead. What did you want to say?
I just want to remind folks that we cannot sit here and ignore that for at least for the last year, on very public display, the worst parts of America have been brought from the fringe into the mainstream. So that affects people on both sides. We've talked about white nationalists and white supremacists and the KKK, but there are also when this inflammatory rhetoric is out there, when someone is repeatedly telling you that your community is the worst of the worst, it brings out the worst of the worst in people.
No, I have to agree with her on that. This definitely didn't come out of thin air. We have been seeing the worst of the worst come out in people in the last few years, particularly from these radical fringe political groups. And this is really taking me back. I don't know about you, but...
I believe vote Trump, damn it! You voted Trump! You voted Trump! Oh, yeah! Yeah, you voted Trump! She been so yeah! Oh, yeah. Oh, y'all vote. I gotta do that to her. Oh, yeah. Damn. Beat his ass! Don't vote Trump. Don't vote Trump! Don't vote Trump! Yeah, this shit didn't it.
This was wrong, it was sickening, it was grotesque, they need help, they need to be punished, but we also have to have an elevated conversation about the surroundings and the things that our young people are dealing with every day and the images that they're seeing. They might not watch the news, but they're on Twitter where the president-elect is. They're on Facebook. They're listening to the Breakfast Club. They're listening to the radio. And all of these nasty, nasty things that we've talked about, that we've witnessed over the last year, they have seeped into our children.
You're damn right. They are on Twitter, and these values have seeped into our children. Hey, on the bright side, at least Emmett Renson, an editor at Vox.com, won't be losing any sleep over this.
They are in our schools, and it is coming to bear its ugly head. And
what the fuck? Oh, bitch! Fuck you, bitch! Fuck you, bitch! Fuck you, bitch!
She said, "Do you hate Mexicans?" And I was like, "No." And she said, "You support Trump, you hate Mexicans."
Jade says the girl hit her, threw her to the ground, and pulled out her earrings and her hair.
Yeah, you should be good. You didn't say anything to anybody? You were just walking out, or what?
I was walking out with a Trump sign. They grabbed my Trump sign and started following me, saying I was like a racist.
So you know what? Maybe Simone is onto something here. Ultimately, the Chicago police did charge those kidnappers with hate crimes for what they did to that white kid. But maybe we should be taking a closer look at the political elements at play. Just what happens when liberal media and liberal culture repeatedly send a message to minorities that when they commit acts of hate and discrimination and violence against white people, that these are somehow less severe than when white people commit acts of hatred and violence towards them? What happens when senior editors at large-scale media outlets encourage rioting, destruction of property, and look the other way when violence is committed against white Trump voters? I think we're seeing what happens. I think we're seeing loud and clear what happens when liberals send this kind of message to minority communities. We are seeing riots. We're seeing cities burned down. People are getting sucker punched and assaulted in the street. Women are getting assaulted in the street. White people are being kidnapped and brutalized live on Facebook with the very clear intention of sending a political message. If you're a white person and you are suspected of voting for Trump, this is what happens. This is what you get. And it has the backing and the stamp of approval from liberal media. So when it comes to this UC Berkeley murder, maybe it's not the gender identity that we should be fixated on. Maybe it's the person's politics. Maybe it's the communities that they were involved in and the culture that they create. So let's take a look. Well, as it turns out, Pablo Gomez just so happens to be a very vocal left-wing activist who is a strong proponent of multiple progressive causes and movements like Black Lives Matter. They were a Chicano-Latin American Studies major, which is a hotbed for critical theory that redefines racism as something only white people can commit against minorities, not the reverse. The victim was a young white schoolteacher named Emily Inman. Now, the motive for the murder is still unclear. I have no idea whether it was racially motivated or not. But as Simone points out, it's really important that we take a look at the political messages that are being sent to the kids that are involved in these kinds of violent crimes. So I looked around and was able to find some of Pablo Gomez's Facebook posts. I found one of them kind of interesting. In what reads to me like a very typical Black Lives Matter rant, Gomez, rather ironically, bemoans the extrajudicial murder of black people, which he chalks up to being part of colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, and cis-heteropatriarchy, which to me rather excludes gender from being one of the motives for his crime. He ends his rant with a demand for immediate, concrete action, asking his readers, what will you do, how will you act to sever the hold of these systems on America? Now, as I said, I don't know the motive for this murder. I don't know if Emily Inman was a conservative or if she voted for Trump or if she was targeted for her political affiliation. What I do know is that Pablo Gomez surrounded himself by a culture and ideology that convinced him that immediate and concrete action was necessary to achieve his goals. I know that he surrounded himself with a culture and an ideology that told him that he could not be racist towards white people, and that minorities in America are oppressed and deserve and are entitled to reparations and retaliatory behavior towards people that they deem their oppressors. I know that he lived in a country where a liberal media has encouraged and promoted riots and violence against white people and against Trump voters. I know that if the liberal media is going to place the blame for the UCSB shooting on toxic masculinity and hate crimes against minorities on Donald Trump and the alt-right, then it is about fucking time that they take some responsibility and get held accountable for the culture that they are creating when they redefine racism, excuse and even promote violence from minorities against white people and against Trump voters. This has gone far enough.